Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the Iscia seminar, Horizon 2055. This is about the 18th seminar in our series. Yeah, it is the 18th. And we can look forward to two more for the year. Um, and today, though, I'm very happy to introduce you to Chantelle Gray. I'm sure most of you know her. She's a professor of philosophy at UJ, grappling with the digital age and what that means in terms of care, care for humans, care for the earth. Not sure if I should call Chantelle a Deleuze and Guattari scholar because she's got a strong anarchistic bent and she's written about them in terms of or in relation to anarchism. So in the talk today, she's going to appeal to Deleuze to help us negotiate a way through this question of why we should bother believing in this world when there's so many reasons not to. Um, and then is it this a kind of a quintessential anarchic question? Not sure. But in any event, as Chantal notes, maybe this just isn't the right question. So Deleuze, and I should say drawing directly from Heidegger, would insist that we need to pose better questions. And Chantal's question is, well, how? So welcome, Chantal. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, and over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. That's a very gracious introduction. Thanks for taking the time to prepare that and introduce me. It's really nice to be here. I'm always happy to do anything for you because, I think everyone here knows that Andrea has done a lot for our community. So this feels like a little bit of giving back, which is very nice. I'm going to share my screen with you if I can. So just give me a moment. Okay. Mostly for the little slides in the beginning. Okay. So let me also say hi to everyone. And thanks for joining. It's the end of the year. Everyone's busy. I really appreciate it, especially on a Friday afternoon in October. And so you would have seen that the title of my talk is Fabulating Futures. And this is something I kind of have been wondering about is there are different views on this these days, but why should we be thinking about saving the future, or should we be thinking about saving the future? And it seems sometimes kind of impossible. There are so many reasons not to. There's climate collapse, there's wars, armed conflicts, states of exception, states of emergency, naturalized forms of state pressure, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, nationalisms, and this is not to mention algorithmic governmentality, broken social relations, the proliferation of conspiracy theories, fake news, election hacking, large-scale right-wing mobilization, disease, and pandemics. And it would seem from this that devastation is the new normal, so part of everyday life that it has all but been invisibilized. And so given this, why would or should we bother finding reasons to believe in this world, or reasons to fabulate viable futures? And more importantly, what is stopping us from doing it now? So many of you, I'm sure, remember 20 January 2021. I remember it vividly. That auspicious day marking the end of the first Trump era and what seemed then to be the dawn of sanity, or at least so much of the world was hoping. Now, curiously, it was not the inauguration of Joe Biden that will be remembered, but the meme that you see right here of Senator Bernie Sanders, a maddening reminder of what could have been twice. So you will recall that Sanders sought the Democratic Party's vote in 2016, only to lose to Hillary Clinton, and then he to support Biden and unite against Trump. So the meme that captured the world's attention features Senator Sanders sitting cross-legged on a chair, donning knitted wool mittens, a sensible winter coat, and a mask, the latter a crude mnemonic of the then ongoing pandemic. Now, in many ways, as you see, the image is pedestrian, but something of the mood clearly captured what was happening in the social imaginary. And so what began as a Twitter post soon snowballed into an internet sensation, with Sanders transposed into virtually every conceivable situation. And so there you see Bernie on the Iron Throne. Bernie is Baby Yoda, anime Bernie in Totoro. And in one of my favorites, maybe a bit more obscure, is Bernie sitting next to a grand piano performing John Cage's 433. And so for those of you not familiar, this piece actually instructs musicians to refrain from playing their instruments. And so the idea is to get the audience to listen to the ambient sounds all around them. But beside the facile interpretations of its curmudgeonly disposition, what captured the social imaginary for me in a bitter twist of irony was an acknowledgement of the end of imagination, as Arundhati Roy called it in her famous piece by the same name. The meme, in other words, was a placeholder for the failure to think outside the constraints of our limitations, counting the limitations of liberal or representative democracy, which, as Cindy Milstein points out, is a rather anachronistic ideal, given that democracies comprise layers of non-representative statecraft that work hand in hand with equally undemocratic international NGOs and multinational financial bodies. In a very real sense, what we see here is a failure of the imagination, but also a failure of the state. And yet, despite this, a world beyond the state remains inconceivable to most human beings. This, even though, and many people don't actually realize this, we have only lived as status societies for a relatively short period of our history. And so this is what I call statist realism. And for those of you who know Mark Fisher's work, I'm riffing off his notion of capitalist realism, which he based on the slogan attributed to both Frederick Jameson and Zizek, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And so what Fisher argues is that capitalism has infiltrated the social imaginary to such an extent that it is now presumed almost universally to be the only viable political and economic system. So like capitalist realism, statist realism goes hand in hand with a prevalent sense of exhaustion, of cultural and political sterility that forms the background conditioning of our collective thought and action. And so statist realism really posits the state as the horizon of human possibility, such that a coherent and viable replacement for it is virtually inconceivable. And so what we have then is an image of thought or an image of society that overlays every other thought, making it impossible to think life outside or beyond statist organization. In other words, thought itself conforms to the form of the state apparatus, the hierarchizing, homogenizing, and normalizing mechanism by which a social field is arranged. And so to put it plainly, it is the reproduction of the logics and techniques of the state in our thought patterns. And so because the limitations placed on our politics by statist realism, a number of scholars have begun to argue against human futurity. So Patricia McCormack, as you see in the middle, makes a powerful argument for the cessation of human life in order to effectuate what she says an opening to the expressive potential of the other. And so what she says is that we should die out, we should allow ourselves to die out to allow the rest of the world to live. And so also referencing the work of Deleuze and Guattari, she argues that what the earth demands of us now is that we escape the universal standard of the human against which the polyvocal subjectivities of other animals and the earth itself is measured. We find likewise an antisocial turn in queer theory, inspired in large by Leo Bersani's book, Homos, but which found what was perhaps its most fertile ground in Lee Edelman's book, No Future. And so like Bersani and McCormack, Edelman finds the politics we turn to insufficient because the majoritarian signifiers it is grounded in can only ever bestow, to quote him, a sort of promissory identity, one with which we can never fully coincide. So given this, and the many other reasons there are not to believe in this world, I ask again, should we give a damn about fabulating futures? It seems to me that we have lost so much already. And perhaps it is because we have lost so much that Deleuze, in his book Cinema 2, argues that it is precisely in our universal schizophrenia that we need to find reasons to believe in this world again. But for me, it is in fact Bifo Berardi who expresses it best. And he says, "My knowledge and understanding must the event, the singularity. So I must act as if the forces of labor and knowledge might overcome the forces of greed, as if the cognitive workers might overcome the fractalization of their life and intelligence and give birth to the self-organization of collective knowledge. I must resist simply because I cannot know what will happen after the future, and I must preserve the consciousness and sensibility of social solidarity, of human empathy, of gratuitous activity, of freedom, equality, and fraternity. Just in case, right? To be sure, believing in this world, like fabulating futures, is a gratuitous activity. But for me, it is one I think we can't afford to negate, because our very lives, and in fact, the lives of all inhabitants of this planet, depend on it. The stakes are huge, and as we all know, we may already be too late. But we must act as if. So while I'm sympathetic to McCormack, Bersani, and Edelman's ahuman and antisocial politics, I want to argue in this talk for futurity and for fabulation, for that as if, that lets us feel that this world is not enough. Not just because we're destroying everything by our very own hands, but more importantly, because the thing that is missing, as Deleuze would say, must be called forth. It must be fabulated. So how do we do this? Okay, so I don't actually have all the answers, but there's a passage in the preface to Deleuze's Difference in Repetition that I like very much. And the passage I'm going to talk about is actually a kind of throwaway remark that he makes, but it's kind of stuck with me, and I've developed it into something that I hope we can talk about. And so in the preface, he says something kind of peculiar. He says that a book of philosophy, or then a philosophical problem, and for him, a problem is something that is productive, right? It is the problems we pose, as he says, always get the answers they deserve. So we have to pose good problems. And he says that good philosophical problems should have three aspects. One part taking the form of a detective novel, another the form of a science fiction novel, and the third the form of an apocalyptic novel. So let's see what this means. So for me, this idea of a detective novel is really what I would call the posing of problems. It's what we go looking for, right? We're trying to establish the coordinates of our thought, and we're trying to think actually outside of that. And so there are so many reasons, so many issues we can talk about, but perhaps I can borrow a phrase from Sully Rolnick to ask, what is appropriating the essence of life? Its potency, the germinating potency of life itself. And as Deleuze and Guattari would prompt us to go on to ask, how do they work? How do these forces work? This is an important question because while we have pretty good analyses of the state, of capitalism, of hierarchies of domination flowing from these, We are currently faced with near incomprehensible environmental catastrophes and advances in digital technology that have rendered politics just about unintelligible in its fragmentation, virulency, and power asymmetries. And what makes any analysis trickier is that rather than following the logics of the state apparatus or capitalism, the algorithmic landscape recodes all of these by mimicking many of the tactics that Deleuze and Guattari call a minor politics, a politics against the state and against capitalist modes of being and thinking. So what does it mean for our political praxis when the tactics of a minor politics can no longer easily be distinguished from that of majoritarian forms? When Trump is king and Antifa, as he says it, are the baddies. How, when everything is topsy-turvy, can we distinguish novelty from genuine fabulation? Simply, how do we face head-on the challenge of the clash against reactive forces when we no longer clearly know what is real or algorithmic prompted and preempted? And so this is why Deleuze asks us to treat philosophical problems as we would a detective novel, because we need to find new coordinates of thought, new concepts with which to think, and new ways in which to prefigure the conditions that we need to call forth a new people and a new earth. We have to pose good problems. The second is life as a science fiction novel. And so for me, once we have kind of reorientated our thought, we've come up with new concepts to think with, why are we doing that? And for me, the reason is to call forth the yet to come, to invent a people. And so Deleuze creates this concept of fabulation because he finds the notion of utopia too close to something like a blueprint. And here he's very close to anarchist thought. And so fabulation is neither an unattainable ideal nor an imaginary future. It's not a blueprint or a rigid plan. Instead, it can be thought of as a persistent becoming, a stubborn impulse towards freedom. To call forth a people means for Deleuze that people have to invent themselves in new conditions of struggle. And so this becoming is clearly a politics other than assimilation or inclusion. It's not just a struggle of recognition and representation. It's something, and it's not to dismiss those kinds of politics, but it's something more than that. And so fabulation is for him a process of continually putting into crisis a lived actual, which at the same time indicates the impossibility of living. And so here attention in fabulation becomes apparent, at least as it pertains to the digital condition. Because how can we engage in the making of worlds when we are continuously disengaging through processes of externalization? And so to explain what I mean by that, I'm going to turn to Bernard Stiegler for just a moment. It's a bit of a funny picture, but I quite like it. Captures something of his spirit for me. So for those of you who don't know, Bernard Stiegler died about 5 years ago. So he was a philosopher of technology his entire life. And he takes up this point of externalization in his own work, arguing that, and he draws on some paleoanthropologists to make this argument, but he says the movement from the hand to the tool is not just about the invention of technologies and the extension of our abilities through them. It is more readily about an invention of life by means other than life. And so exteriorizing our knowledge and memory into tools, technologies, and artifacts is in fact what has allowed for the creation of culture, because it allows for long-term or intergenerational transfer. So if you think about books, for example, how we've passed knowledge on through books, through artworks, artifacts, all of these things, right? It's kind of collective memory that we're sharing. And so exteriorizing our knowledge and memory becomes a kind of extension, right? An extension of our knowledge. And it begins to function like a non-genetic memory, which is exterior to the living organism, qua individual, but it is supported by a non-zoological collective organization of objects. And yet it functions and evolves as this quasi-biological milieu. So even though we have extensions, and we can see this so clearly in the phone, right? The phone, the cell phone, is an extension of our lives in many ways. We think with it, we travel with it, it's always there. And in a way, it's got this kind of, becomes a quasi-causal object with us as part of our milieu. But even though this exteriorization allows for culture, allows us to share amazing knowledge across many generations, it also raises the question of adjustment between technical and social milieus. Because when a technical system becomes radically transformed, as it has with the digital, there occurs a disadjustment, which is the result of a change that unfolds in social systems and that begins to form a disturbance. And so this is not a problem per se, because of course, any change can provoke novel individuations. But the trouble for Stigler, at least, is when digital tertiary retentions substitute themselves for psychic and collective ones, thereby disrupting the production of shared systems of meaning, as we see in our societies today, and the creation of new metastable conditions that are themselves occasioned by efficacious social trans-individuations that create relationships of solidarity on which durable social and political systems can be built. And I think this is one of the things that, for me, is kind of stands out about contemporary society right now in the last I'd say 5 to 10 years. There's been such a change in how we do politics and how we think about what political organization is and political participation is. And here, this is, Stigler calls it, what does he call it? Long circuits, I think. But it's that idea of like, you know, if you look at South Africa's history and you think about people who were part of the struggle, and that memory became part of the next generation, right? But as we are going on, as time goes on, and as we become more enculturated into the digital, those memories are disappearing. Those ways of doing politics are kind of disappearing. And also those ways of creating solidarity. And so that's part of the stuff that I'm kind of trying to think about, is how do we fabulate futures when we don't have these societies, these networks of solidarity, right? So how can we fabulate worlds when the life of the mind is set outside itself? When digital retentions are interiorized in place of psychic and social ones, causing people far and wide to always already be dreaming the next stages of their self-externalization into their digital companions, the cell phone being paradigmatic. How can we participate in curative practices when this exosomatization occasions a toxic form of sublimation, a spiritual misery that gives rise to the paralysis of spirit? And I mean spirit here in the broad sense, right? Short-circuiting the very possibility of constituting horizons of expectation of a we, as Stigler argues. How can we build futures when there is only an I and a they, caught in a cataclysm of resentment? And so the thing is that once we diagnose problems, and we're quite good at diagnosing our problems, right? There's this kind of relationship between fabulating, inventing a people, and the problems we pose. because when we pose questions, we should be careful not to pose a solution within the framework of what already is. And so this is why the science fictional dimension is located outside the coordinates of what is, so that we can redistribute heres and nows differently as other than what exists. And so even though there is clearly a need to respond to the loss of intergenerational memory transfer, it should not be confused with the status project of memorialization. And so instead of asking, how ought the algorithm be arranged for a good society, a more prefigurative approach would be to ask, what is a good society, right? It's a very old philosophical question, but it's quite a good one, I think. So right now we're constantly thinking about how to be more ethical about the digital, but we're not asking ourselves, what is it that we want our societies to look like? And so when we do this, though, it changes the conditions from which the problem is posed, thereby affecting what is possible for the fabulation of a future that is different from its current trajectories of disease, destruction, and death. And then finally, we have life as an apocalyptic novel. And so this is, there's a kind of twist in here because it's the apocalypse for me that makes this idea of life worth living. And maybe it doesn't seem so strange to everyone here, but it is, if you think about, there was recently an apocalyptic series, and I can't remember, The Last of Us, there we go. If you think about watching The Last of Us, the thing that they're looking for, or the thing that makes the kind of series go, is that these people are trying to find reasons to make life worth living, despite the zombie apocalypse. And so this is the tension for me that resides here. And so in Difference in Repetition, Deleuze says that to throw the dice is to affirm all of chance, which is to say that it is an affirmation of contingency. And so this is a funny thing because we often think, you know, when you hear about people speaking about Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari, they often talk about them, they often talk about affirmation in a way that seems to be affirming only what is good in the world. And that's not exactly what it means. It's not to say that we must now go and affirm the bad things, but it's to say that there's a throw of the dice. There's a kind of contingency that we must affirm. And that's quite a difficult to think about in terms of like political praxis, right? How do you do this politically, practically? It sounds very poetic to say, you know, affirm all of chance, throw the dice, whatever. You know, affirm the eternal return. But to think about it practically is more difficult. And so here I actually found quite a good example from the Zapatistas, and they're an my words are slow today, are funny today. An indigenous movement in Mexico's southern eastern state of Chiapas. And so they confirm contingency through the practice of preguntando caminamos, which roughly translates as asking we walk. And so this is a radical break with states who are always posing answers with ready-made solutions, right? That determine in advance what can unfold. It's also a radical break with algorithmic prompts that determine our behavior and thoughts preemptively. Asking as we walk challenges us theoretically and practically to conceive differently of politics, of community, and of revolution, as Thomas Nail argues. In the words of the Zapatistas, this is really beautiful. Then that suffering that united us made us speak, and we recognized that in our words there was truth. We knew that not only pain and suffering lived in our tongue, we recognized that there is hope still in our hearts. However, before wielding a future for themselves through their collective enunciations, the Zapatistas had to fabulate themselves, which they accomplished through the compa. And the compa, instead of reveling in the glory and accomplishments of the individual, you know, that figurehead, accentuates the power of collectivity through a becoming imperceptible, achieved practically by the wearing of masks. And so this is them. This is how they protest. So the masked camper disrupts majoritarian signifiers of representation and recognition through a double movement, that of withdrawal from the majority and that of inventing themselves as the missing people, thereby putting into crisis the impossibility of living in captivity. In a continual movement of becoming, the camper prefigures a revolutionary subjectivity as a block, like the black blocks, or like a building block. At times a shield, at other times a weapon. But how can we become imperceptible when we are so very overexposed in the everyday life of the digital? How can we practice this kind of politics when the forms of communication produced by social media are designed to tend towards hyperbole, immediacy, and biochemical affectivity? In this environment of algorithmic governance, it is no longer the face that functions as a central signifier, but the avatar. A subjectivity that emerges from the point of data subjectification and its attendant statistical statements. So just as linguistic statements emanate from the face, so too digital statements emerge from the avatar, the mean definitive thereof. And here, of course, I'm not referring simply to digital images, videos, GIFs, and so on, but more specifically to the idea that memes now form part of the stuff of our collective digital unconscious. So what now? Now, Deleuze and Guattari might tell us that we need new weapons and escape routes, sentiments echoed by all who have embodied a revolutionary spirit of insurrection or participated in communizing processes that resist mass media homogenization and technological overdependence and addiction. To borrow from Rolnick again, this means practically undoing our numbness and becoming vulnerable to the forces that compose the living body of the biosphere. This may mean at times refusing to interpret the fragility of unstable states and the discomfort they trigger as if they were bad things. Diagnosing such feelings is what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick calls a reparative hermeneutics, a practice that replaces paranoid readings and practices of resentment with a restorative praxis aimed at transformation, hope, and surprise. And so it is a double movement too, one of becoming and of unbecoming. Apocalyptic for the throw of the dice, the willing of the eternal return, a universal ungrounding which turns upon itself and causes only the yet to come to return. And so for me, it's Bernie as a compa. A new image of thought. And of course, these new images of thought, it's not a small task. It's especially not a small task given the visibility of our data selves and the complexity each person is tasked with every day, combined with the lack of shared practices of meaning, making, and care. We have to ameliorate the sense of an ending. In a very real sense, it's an emergent strategy, one that emphasizes critical connections over critical mass. This is a joyful militancy, but it is not for the faint-hearted. For fabulation is not without heartache or hardship. It does not come without loss, though it is a reclamation of dignity, the yabasta of the Zapatistas, a dignified rage chiming, enough, enough, enough. The secret is to find the others and begin. Anywhere, everywhere, now. Thank you.
Fab, Chantelle. Thanks so much. It was extremely rich, very poetic, lots of questions. So if you want to ask questions, raise your hand. I see there are claps flying up my screen, so that signs of appreciation. Otherwise, stick some comments in the chat, and then I'll ask you to speak to them if you want to. Okay, so while you gather your thoughts, I'm going to jump right in there and ask you a question that's really bothering me a bit. And that is to do with the idea of our self-externalization, our kind of being as what Freud called prosthetic gods. Yeah. And I think it's a misnomer now, and I'm starting to get quite concerned about our externalization into AI. And I think it's going too fast for us, and we're not able, I'm certainly not able to catch up with it. And so I'm wondering if that makes it possible for us to intentionally fabulate anything, because this is running away beyond our powers. So that's something that I'd very much like you to chat about if if you'd like to.
Absolutely. I think about that too a lot.
Mm.
I think one of the crises we've had for a couple of years is precisely that, is that because it's changed so fast, theory hasn't caught up. And I
Mm.
actually think that that is part of the detective part, is we need to radically be changing how we think about this. And I'm also still using old language because that's what I have to describe it at the moment. But it's a kind of question I've been sitting with, because I know we need different language, we need different concepts. We need to think somehow ahead of this thing. We need to think beyond it to realize what we need to theorize. And it's so difficult. I think it's been so difficult because it's almost like every other month there's been a new change and a different transformation. And I'm seeing a little bit of maybe it's a consolidation and a kind of halting. And I'm hoping it gives us just a moment, catch our breaths, and kind of catch up with us, because I think that is what is required, And I think if Deleuze was here today in the audience, he would say to me, why are you using my words? Go and create your own concepts. And that is really the challenge, right? Is to come together. And I think we actually need to come together for that, because part of the problem of digitality is its fragmentation. It's fragmenting us. And I think we really need offline social groups, political groups, where we sit together and kind of fabulate this together, because theory and practice go together, and I think that's what we need. We can't just be like online, caught up in the digital, thinking that we're going to find answers for thinking outside of it.
Mm. True. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. Would somebody like to comment or question? Not seeing hands in my thingy, but
Sorry. Hi, Andrea.
hi Dominic, how are you?
Sorry. Well, and you?
Good.
Thank you. Thanks, Chantelle. Thank you. That was lovely. I was just thinking, the last thing you said made me think of the idea of the public sphere, and how there's this lack or death of the public sphere, particularly in the way that Hannah Arendt develops it, and the importance of action and beginning and risk and all those kinds of things. Yeah, just a sort of thought that popped into my head. Maybe you want to just talk to that a bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And funny enough, I've been thinking about her recently again, because I was trying to show my students that people have been thinking about similar issues we face, even though it was maybe a different era, and trying to think about fascism, the fascisms we're looking at now. But I think that it is exactly that. It's the social has got a very new meaning, right? If I look at my students sometimes, they're sitting next to each other and talking to each other via their phones. And so there's something about there's kind of a mediating force that I think has become so strong, and not just here, that it has kind of taken us out of the public sphere. And I think that there are still places in the world where there is more direct democracy, people still care. I think it also is very difficult in the global south, where we have extra problems. We have problems of corruption, and we have problems of not going out at night because we don't feel safe, maybe, you know? And so there are all these extra layers to this idea of creating society. What is a society? What is a good society? But I think this for me is possibly one of the most important things that we need to not just think about, but create, be actively creative, is a new social public outside of the state apparatus, for the people, right? Made up by the people, for the people. And I think it's a challenge, because it's very difficult to get people out. I think often people don't even want to think about politics, right? Because in their minds, like, politics is not something joyous. I think this is also, and I didn't say this in this talk, but I'm just going to quickly say that. And then I think the right has capitalized on something, which was maybe a misstep on the side of the left, which is about cancel culture. And I understand where it came from. I think it had good roots. So I'm not just going to sit here and say it's bad. I don't think it is. I think that there was something it wanted to achieve. But I think it also closed down desire.
Yeah.
I think that is what we're seeing with the right, is that proliferation of desire, the desire to say anything, to do anything, to be awful, and it's just coming out. And I think part of this creation of the public is creating a left that is fun, that feels good. Because it's part of that creation. It's part of when you participate and you see what that can feel like, the empowerment that can feel like, that's when you want to do more of it, right? Yeah.
Okay, I'm fully with you there on the idea of tapping into emotions and feeling and desire. I think that's really important. I see Emma, you had your hand up, and then Jason. Not sure where Emma's gone. She might.
No, I am
Emma?
here, sorry.
Awesome. Okay.
Apologies, I'm off camera. I'm not at home and the internet connection is not 100%. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Chantelle. I absolutely love listening to you. I always do. And I really appreciate your take on things. And you always provoke lots of thoughts in me that I have to go and process. But I just wanted to get in there while I've got some internet stability, and talk a little bit about, for me, all of this stuff I get really excited by, but then I've always got this question lurking, which I think you are answering, which is like, how do we become other? Like, what is a becoming other look like? If we are to enact, if we are to be a people yet to come, right now, here and now, us talking, where am I in this, and how does this live out, you know, off of the pages of books and the papers we write? Where does it live? And then so I start asking myself, well, how I can't ask what a becoming other looks like for anybody else. So I sort of find myself trapped in this weird individualism, which is like the paradox of it all. But the only way I can imagine envisioning anything different is to first change my own inner world and my own inner life and my daily living, so that I can become some kind of other. But that feels like way too much responsibility, right? So it's like I'm just I'm thinking out loud. It's this grappling. I'm always grappling. Like, what does a becoming other look like for me, and how do I do it? And the only thing I can think of that comes to mind is presencing, actually almost getting out of the way. So slowing down, which I think taps into what you're saying about the digitalized world and the problems with that. So that's actually a really long-winded way of not saying very much, except I feel like there's so much to this, but I'm just trying to find out where my place is within it, you know. So I don't know really what I'm asking, but it's just a comment or a thought, I should say.
Thanks. No, Emma, I really appreciate that, because in fact, that thing of like the individual versus the collective, so on and so on, right? It's always a difficult thing. And I think, you know, a lot is being outsourced to the individual in contemporary society. You have to just go fix yourself, take some pills, go see a psychologist, get on with life, you know, or go to meditation or do whatever, fix yourself, right? But in fact, those things are they're never apart. They're always entangled. And one of the things I learned from anarchists is exactly that. It's in participation. It's in the participation of doing things. Sometimes something simple like whatever, writing to prisoners to support them, or handing out food parcels to hungry people. They don't hand out food. They do food not bombs, which is a kind of a different model, because it allows everyone to come, and it's about creating community. But those actions change you individually, and it's as you change that you're also changing other people, and other people are changing you. And of course, there is that thing where you also have to work on your, you know, on your own attitude and your own mind and all of that stuff. But I think sometimes even something simple like, you know, and maybe this will speak to you, but something like having a collective garden, right? Growing food together, that can do far more than one might think. Or collectively running things, because I think, you know, we're all stuck in these very hierarchical kind of jobs settings, right? But sometimes when you redistribute power in a way, just in where you are, say, how do we make a collective decision about this rather than just me making a decision? It's little things sometimes that can spark bigger things. And that's something that I've realized is that, you know, one wants to think about the revolution, not that anarchists think about the big revolution anymore, but you know, that was like it used to be the talk. But how does that come about? It's not just suddenly there. It doesn't just erupt out of nowhere. It comes because people have been talking about living differently or doing things differently. They've been gardening together. They've been reading books together sometimes, right? So I think it's an incremental thing. That's the thing we have to remember. It's not just about the big actions. It's about all the small actions that begin to work together and resonate each other.
Yeah.
That's
That's
yeah. Sorry, Jason's been waiting a while. I just want to get him up there.
Hi, Jason.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks so much, Chantelle. So I very much enjoyed that, and it resonates with things that I'm concerned about, and a lot of it is theory from a perspective I'm less familiar with. So I just wanted to mention some of what I've been sort of traveling alongside with here, which is I've just been sort of walking honors students through sorry, I blanked for a second. Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's a lot that's very resonant. It's basically picking up from a virtue ethics tradition, and it's a reading of the condition of the Crow Nation, Native American group, living through devastation, living through the end of all of their thick concepts of possibility. And what he does is he picks up on the crow as opposed to the Sioux, and it's more or less a study of what conceptions of virtue people reached for when all points of reference were lost. And he comes to the conclusion that the crow represent a successful example of reimagining what the virtue of courage must mean through living through an apocalypse. And I wanted to say it's very resonant and interesting because he picks up on these things. And indulge me for 1 second, because I've got this thing that I set as a question. It's this excerpt where what Lear says about this Native American struggle through a virtue ethics model is, he says, to be human is necessarily to be a vulnerable risk taker. To be a courageous human is to be good at it. To be a courageous person is to have the psychological resources to face these risks and make good judgments in light of them. At a time of cultural devastation, risks include not only malnutrition, starvation, disease, defeat, and confinement, but loss of concepts. In such circumstances, courage would have to include the ability to live well with the risk of concept loss. So I think a lot of that resonates with this, but the reason I mention it is because I've been finding this a very powerful thing to talk to, especially students in a context of decolonial assessments, because it's about the idea of the virtue of surviving that period of being in the singularity, of being out of any concept. And I think that that's interesting because you're asking this difficult question: where do we find purchase to scrabble through it? And he's making the suggestion that there are historical instances of sort of living through decades, trying to reformat and maybe fabulate anew is what I'm looking for conceptually here. And I thought, with what Emma and you were saying in response to her, it's interesting that some of my paradigms here are things like solar punk thinking, where the idea of what we can imagine as different is just relating to one another in face-to-face conversations while we find the right filter for a septic tank or something. And that becomes the dream, that becomes the new model that we try to imagine ourselves into, just because it's not digitally mediated, just because from where we are now, that's the imagination we play with. So I'm not sure if there was a question in that. I wanted to say that's what's resonating for me about my concerns, and you're pointing away to something else. But at least there's a sort of a fellow traveler literature happening there that I wanted to point to. But I also think actual Native American activists tend to latch onto the sort of resignation to the possibility of defeat and the need to continue in light of it. There's a lot of discussion that the fight might not be winnable, but we're committed to continue. And that's another place where this comes from on the ground, from what I've seen as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm now going to go look that up. It's a lot to think about.
I would very much recommend.
There's definitely like, yeah, sorry.
It's a very short book. Radical Hope is just, it's a fantastic read.
I will definitely read it, yeah.
There's that, yeah. Sorry, thanks. That's it.
No, I think you're right. I think there is a lot that is resonating. I can hear it. There's a lot of resonance there. And I think that's part of it, right? Is one of the things that if we're talking about politics and people and ourselves as part of politics and people and reinventing all of that, I think it does mean being vulnerable to each other, finding ways in which we can expose our hopes and fears to each other, right? Without just saying, it's all rubbish anyway, and what ifs, and which is what we typically do because it's easier. It's easier to just be kind of facetious about it, or or kind of the opposite, overly sentimental And I think we have to find a kind of strike a balance, and that's also finding a way of speaking to each other, reaching out to each other beyond what, and this is something that I've written about and think about a lot, is, we often talk about like, how the algorithm is learning from us. But in fact, the algorithm is teaching us, because when we give in to certain prompts, it's training us to think a certain way. It's training us to be like, oh, I'm excited because I clicked on something and it gave me a little high for a moment. So let me click on something similar. And of course, it's subtle. It's teaching us how to speak to each other. If you think about online spaces, they lend themselves to hyperbole, to quick answers, to being very radical. You're in or you're out, There's no, like, okay, human beings are, and I've been thinking about this because I've been reading Cup recently, and I was thinking he talks about organ projection and how actually externalizing ourselves into technologies had this kind of effect of making us see ourselves. So every time we externalize, we see something of ourselves and we enlarge our insides, our interior, our spirit. I'm just going to call it spirit because life of the mind, that's what I mean, right? Our interior beings. And I feel like there's a closing off of our interior beings. We've taken so many millennia to develop these very complex people that we are. And it's like we're just shutting that down, And so for me, there's a kind of call almost to figure that stuff out again. Like, what it feels like to talk about the difficulties of being, the trickiness. That's what we love about these philosophers, right? Is that they tap into something that we can't really, something ineffable, right? Something that we're grappling with. And I think that's something that's so special about life, all life in the broader sense. And so what does it mean to live life in that way, collectively? And I think that is the thing that I'm trying to say, is part of it is vulnerability and the idea that we might fail.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One quick way, I've got an eye on time, sadly, but there's something I'm burning to ask you to explain a bit more, just a little bit, and that's your image of Bernie, the avatar Bernie in the mask.
Yes.
In relation to all of the stuff that you've been saying, because the image is highly, what would you say, paradoxical, complex, or whatever.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of the people who masked themselves, I can't remember the name, but in any event,
The Batistas, yeah.
to, as far as I understand, to kind of confirm their collective being.
Yeah.
And yet the kind of mask that they wore just focuses you immediately on their eyes. And the eyes are the most individualizing part of who you are. So that was the first thing I looked at. As soon as I saw those people in the masks, I looked at their eyes. Now, if you look at Bernie in the mask, his eyes say it all. So there's this almost impossibility of masking your individuality unless you completely wear, you can't do it if you leave your eyes open. And then the idea that behind an avatar, you can completely hide. So, so the whole thing is a very mixed up image, and maybe that's the complexity that you want to bring out. I was just curious about it and very interested to know what you, why you chose that image.
Yeah, I actually made that image. I asked a friend of mine, who is a really wonderful artist, to draw it for me, and she did. She complied. And it is part of what I'm playing with, because I think we don't want to just squash individuality, even though we want to affirm collectivity, and there are amazing ways to do it. And we don't always have to do it by masking, but there are reasons people do it. Black blocs do it also, or Antifa, not Antifa, does it to, also to protect themselves from surveillance and what have you. But I think it's exactly what you're saying, right? The avatar, you can be anyone. You literally can be anyone. You can be many people, in fact. And there's a sense in which it gives you license. And the license it gives you is one that doesn't allow for accountability.
Mm.
And I think the thing about the compa and the mask that still shows your eyes is that there is a call to be responsible to the collective. You can't just get away. They still know who you are. And I think that that is actually something that we have also lost. Somebody said something to me the other day about, what was it? They were saying something, and I know where it comes from. They were saying something like, oh, but not to put any expectations on you or something like that. And I said, but why not? If people don't expect something from me, it means they don't trust me. I want people to expect something from me. I want my partner to expect something from me. I want the world to expect something from me. It means I'm responsive to them. And so I think that there are these weird things that have crept kind of into how we think about ourselves in relation to the collective, that we really need to kind of start interrogating and say, hold on, man, I am a compa, but I'm also, as you say, my eyes. I like that a lot. I'm responsive to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a wonderful note to end on. We're running out of, well, we've run out of time. We've gone over, but yeah, as usual, we could be talking all afternoon. But thank you so much for kind of so many kind of avenues and links and ideas that we're going to have to all start thinking about, and we'll put the presentation on YouTube so we can all go back to it. Yeah, and then next week we'll continue the discussion, the Deleuze, hopefully, and Guattari discussion, because we'll be having Ian Buchanan coming to talk about the scream of nature. So I hope all the Deleuze people will join us. But yes, thank you, Chantelle. That was wonderful. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone.